Hi everyone. Now, this is a project that has been cooking away at the back of my brain for a little while now. I've finally taken the plunge, and I can't wait to share these Kingsmen with you. But who are the Kingsmen? You might know them better by their third age name, the Black Numenoreans. But their history begins thousands of years before the War of the Ring, at the start of the Second Age. Bear in mind what follows is a very oversimplified summary of the rise and fall of Numenor. After Beleriand fell into the sea at the end of the First Age, the faithful men who fought alongside the Elves and the Valar were rewarded with a land of their own. The island of Numenor was raised from the ocean, and the men who dwelt there were gifted with a much longer lifespan than those who continued to dwell in Middle-earth. For centuries, Numenor prospered. They explored and colonized Middle-earth, sharing some of their wisdom with the men who still lived there. The Numenoreans traded with the elves of Lindon, but their near limitless expansion was barred only by a decree of the Valar, which forbade them from sailing their mighty ship west to the Undying Lands. In the year 1695 of the Second Age, Sauron, who had returned to power after the defeat of his master Morgoth, launched an attack on the elves of Eregion in an attempt to claim the rings of power for himself. This war went pretty poorly for the elves, and they were basically defeated, their kingdoms smashed, until an army from Numenor arrived from the west to smash Sauron's forces and drive him back to Mordor. Now, despite this overwhelming victory for the elves and the men, this war arguably marks the beginning of the end of the golden age of Numenor, not in terms of their power, but in terms of their wisdom and their goodness. The kings of men began to fear death more and more, and grew to resent the immortal elves, as well as the Valar, who were keeping them from eternal life, or so the humans thought. This saw a split in Numenorian society. The king's men, those who became arrogant and prideful, were pitted against the faithful, who continued to follow the old ways and stayed faithful to the Valar, the elves, and Eru Ilúvatar. Over the next 1,000 or so years, the Numenorians continued to move further and further away from the light. No longer did they try to raise up the men of Middle-earth, but they enslaved them so that their tall ships began to cause fear and despair whenever they appeared on the horizon. They distanced themselves from the elves, and they stopped trading with them, and they stopped working with them to try and improve the world. The final king of Numenor was a chap called Ar-Pharazôn, who you can see here. During his reign, Sauron attempted another conquest of Middle-earth, and he started calling himself the Lord of Men and King of Everything. Ar-Pharazôn was not happy about this, of course thinking he himself was the King of Men, and he set sail with a force so powerful that Sauron's armies didn't even fight them, they just all ran away, and the Dark Lord was brought in chains back to Numenor. Now, a little bit of an aside here. It's unclear how much of this was all planned by Sauron. I like to think that he had a bit of a cunning plan to bring about the downfall of Numenor by allowing himself to be captured. Either way, within a few years, Sauron was no longer a prisoner, but had ended up Ar-Pharazôn's basically chief advisor and was really the power behind the throne. By this point, the King's Men, the Numenoreans, had gone completely off the deep end. They were openly worshipping Morgoth and Sauron, engaging in dark rituals and human sacrifice. As Ar-Pharazôn got older and saw his death approaching, Sauron convinced him to declare war on the Valar and to invade the Undying Lands and claim immortality from them. This went about as well as you would expect, with his army being trapped in Valinor until the end of days, when it will come back and fight in basically Middle-earth's version of Ragnarok. And Eru Ilúvatar sank the island of Numenor in his anger and disappointment in how the men of Numenor had acted. The ships of the faithful were blown eastward by this terrible storm, where they went on to found the realms of Gondor and Arnor. But a number of the king's men also managed to live through this destruction, holding on to their colonies like Umbar and others that are further south that we don't know a huge amount about. They continued to serve Sauron well into the Third Age, and probably likely right up until the War of the Ring, where you have people like the Mouth of Sauron who served right up until the end of the war. So when I start a project like this, I like to try and put together a mood board or collage of various images, artwork, screen captures of things that are going to inspire me for the project. Now, I looked at a lot more than what I'm going to show you guys here, but these are the main ones that served as the sort of focal point for the project. The first up is this pretty famous image by John Howe. I've tried to credit the artists where I could in everything. This shows a Black Numenorean with a chain mask and plate armor. Obviously in this dark black grey armor, it just looks really cool, really imposing. You can imagine if you are some poor Haradrim and you just see these guys getting off of a ship, you're not going to know what's hit you. And that was something I really wanted to go for, intimidation factor for the army. Next up are these really cool kind of cult-looking images for Skullbastard, or from Skullbastard on DeviantArt. I really love the masks here. Now these were what I was looking for when I did my cultists of Sauron, which didn't actually make it into the first wave of the army because they were delayed in the post. The joys of living in the north of Scotland, unfortunately. But I will definitely come back to these, and I'll show you some of the models that I went for that were tied in with these. Now, the next one we've got is, now I'm going to butcher this pronunciation. I think it's Clyroj? Clyroj? And again, you're seeing the chainmail, the raggedy clothes, and the masks. Again, I wanted as much of these guys' faces to be covered up as possible. This anonymity, and you don't know really what's going on behind these masks. Are they even completely mortal, or are they something else going on there? Or is there something else going on there? Now, last but definitely not least, I've got this screen capture. Now, unfortunately, it's a little bit blurry, a little bit pixelated, but this is from the Divide and Conquer mod for Medieval Total War 2. I played loads of this over lockdown. It's a great mod, and yeah, it's awesome. Basically, the Ardenine, I think they call their Black Numenorean faction. They're a pike and crossbow faction, and really, this is how I wanted to arm my guys, especially with these big pike blocks. I was also inspired by the Crusaders in Diablo, but I didn't want to put a screen capture up of that because I know some people are probably still playing that, and I wanted to stay away from spoilers as much as possible. But the main takeaways from this were masks or chainmail veils, I suppose you'd call them, covering the face, plate or chainmail or scale mail armor, pikes and big shields in a phalanx. So, bearing all that in mind, I had to start looking for kits to use in the kit bashing process. I wanted to keep as much of this as possible in plastic, just because it's so much easier to work with, and I didn't fancy drilling and pinning parts. The first kit that I came across, well, not the first kit that I came across, but the first one I really, really liked were the medieval Russian infantry from Fireforge Games, which you can see here. They have long chainmail sort of tunicky things, as well as the chainmail masks, as well as a few actual masks that you can stick over their faces. Unfortunately, not all of these heads came with the chainmail completely covering the faces. This one on the left, you can see, was definitely my favorite helmet that came in the collection. But there was enough in there with most of their faces covered that I thought these were probably good enough. And if I paint the faces quite dark, it'll look like they're in shadow anyway, which is what I went for, at least I hope was the look I got. Now, originally, I wanted to do these guys with square Roman shields, the scutum. They were basically because they looked cool and I had loads of them lying around. However, when I did a bit of a mock up and played around with some blue tack, they looked too Roman. When you're using historical kits to put together conversions for Lord of the Rings or another fantasy setting, it's a really fine line that you tread between just gluing some random historical stuff together and having a cultural look that ties your fantastical army together. And yeah, the square shields were just too much, so I went for these instead. Now they're still Roman scutums, but they're slightly more rounded. I think these are earlier than the Imperial legionary shields that you maybe see in films like Gladiator, and those of you who are more historically clued up than me will probably have better examples. They look like a shield wall enough. They're pretty big on the models, but they didn't scream immediately, these are just Roman guys. Now, for the pikes, I got these 80mm metal pikes from Warlord Games. And I'm sure you can probably get these cheaper elsewhere, but I had some lying around from a Macedonian project that I will definitely finish at some point. These are very sharp. I think what I probably should have done was clip the ends off a little bit because I've stabbed myself a couple of times. So if you're planning on using these for anything, just be very careful. And for the cavalry and the mounted heroes, I decided to go with these Corsores from the Byzantine range from Fireforge Games. They have a few armored horse options in the Byzantine range. They've got cataphracts with armor on the back of the horse as well. But I wanted them to kind of tie into what we've seen in Rings of Power, as well as maybe be a predecessor to the Easterling horses that we see in the Middle Earth strategy battle game. So I went for these, I guess, half-barded horses, you'd call them. And again, they have the cool chain masks. And I armed them all with the swords. Now, last but not least, are these guys. These will be my Cult of Sauron. Now, I'm recording this actually after I put the army together, but they still haven't arrived. There was a bit of a mix-up with postage or something like that, and they haven't arrived yet, but they do look really cool with their creepy masks and their sacrificial daggers, and this guy in the middle. So he will be my war priest, or maybe represent one of the caster heroes. And then these ladies here with the masks will be my dragon acolytes when I run the army as Easterlings. So the stuff for my Black Numenorean Kingsmen arrived this morning. We've got the Russian infantry from Fireforge Games. Those are going to be the bulk of the troops. We've got the Byzantine Corsairs, who are going to be my heavy cavalry. And then I've got some Byzantine spearmen over here. They are basically going to be like dismounts, and I might make some captains and things out of them. They've got some slightly fancier armor than the Russians. So it's probably time to start talking about the actual project and doing some hobby. I did record some footage of me sticking these guys together, but to be honest, it was pretty boring. The kits come with the torso and legs together, the arms and heads are separate. All I had to really do was stick the pike on. Now, the pikes were quite fiddly. They took me a little while to get them into position because I was using super glue.
Maybe if I had roughed up the surface of the brass a little bit, I could have got a slightly better bond, but I was doing this in a rush. Eventually, I managed to get them into position, basically got them to stick by gluing them to the foot and the base as well as the hand. And then to finish off, I just blue tacked the shield on to see how it would look. I wanted to leave that off separately to paint the models so that I could get in behind the armor. With hindsight, I probably didn't need to really bother because they cover so much of the front of the body anyway. But, you know, it's good to get into these good practices. So here you can see the infantry. I forgot to blue tack the shields on, but you get the idea. I wanted to get the feel of a proper pike block. So I didn't bother with any warriors armed with hand weapons and shields. I know that's probably the better choice to take to an event or a tournament, but I'm never going to take this army to a tournament. I wanted to go for a cool factor over what's going to win me games. I'll get my excuses in early anyway. I might add some in at a later date just to give me a different project to do, but I'm pretty happy with how these guys turned out. Luckily, the Fireforged Russians also came with the option to make some archers, so I think I did like 5 or 6 just to go around the flanks of the pipe block. The cavalry had almost no conversion work done to them. They were pretty perfect out of the box. All I really bothered with was a few head swaps and then some shield swaps on the dismounts that I made from the Byzantine spearmen. Their armor matches a little bit more closely to the cavalrymen, so I used those instead of the Russian infantry. They are probably my favourite models in the force. I love how powerful and intimidating they look, and the armoured horses are just awesome. The characters and the command models, I suppose you could call them, were a little bit more involved. The banner bearer is from the Cursores kit. Well, his arm is anyway. It's a bit different to the rest of the pikes. I was a bit worried about the plastic banner sticking to the thin brass pike. I was worried it was going to come off and the hooks wouldn't sit right. I don't think it's too noticeable. Maybe in the future I'll do a bit of a better conversion on this. The drummer, or I guess the war horn guy as he's represented here, has a big trumpet from I think it's a Warlords Roman kit. I think it's their Legionaries kit. I had it in my bits box. Although he's meant to represent a drummer rather than a hornblower, I don't think Easterlings have the option to take a hornblower. And I just thought this looked way cooler than some guy riding around smacking his bongos on the way to battle. The leader, the chap with the big two-handed glaive, is supposed to be Herimor, one of the Kingsmen who became a lord of the Haradrim after the fall of Numenor. Very little is known about him, apart from his name meaning Lord of the Dark in Sindarin, which, let's face it, there's a dozen Dark Lords and Lord of the Darks in Tolkien's Legendarium. I had a lot of flexibility on how I represented him. I wanted to run him using the rules for Amdur, so he needed some kind of two-handed weapon that he could maybe fight with one-handed as well. I'm not 100% happy with how this guy turned out. His weapon is maybe a little bit too big. I do really love the faceplate shieldy mask thing that he has. That comes from the Russian kit. Maybe I'll revisit him in the future. Originally, I had planned to show me painting the army as well, but the video is already pretty long. So I think we'll do a part 2 where I paint up the cultists that came in the post since I've done most of the recording for this. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed, and please like, share, and subscribe. Bye!